So, what is entrainment? First of all, I'm going to do a visual diagram to show you how it actually works, and then I'll give you a definition, right? So, here we have a glacier on a slope, right? And this glacier has rocks in it. But how has that happened? Well, above the glacier, you have freeze-thaw and sort of thrust shattering, which erodes the rock up here and causes rocks to enter the glacier supraglacially. So it will sit on top of the glacier, below the slope, but on top of the glacier, and now that is called supraglacial. So I'm gonna write that down. Supraglacial. Okay, that's anything on top of the glacier. So let's say debris on top of the glacier. Okay. Alright. And within the glacier, on the back wall, you're gonna have something called plucking. If you should hopefully know that what that is if you're learning about this for a course, right? You should have plucking, and plucking, well, that's actually not really. Plucking is where the glacier, the air ice, attaches to the back wall, and it begins to pluck out, it begins to sort of rip out bits of rock. Okay, so you might have bits of rock that have been ripped out, and this rock enters the system englacially. So let's type that out. Englacially, or englacial, anything inside the glacier. So, for example, rocks that entered the glacier through, what do you call it? Plucking. Okay. And then the final method of entrainment, the final way rocks can be entrained, is through abrasion. So abrasion you might have already learned about from rivers, or maybe you've learned about it here. It's basically just where rocks that were subglacial, rocks that were englacial from here or wherever, as far as they've got into the glacier, they scrape across the bottom of the glacier, and what this causes is it causes striations, okay? But as well as that, it also sort of abrades out chunks of rocks which then enter the system subglacially. It enters the bottom of the glacier, okay? And I'll type that out. Subglacial. Anything below the glacier. Now these three definitions aren't solely for rocks, okay? They aren't solely for rocks entering the system, okay? Supraglacial is just anything on top of the glacier, englacial is anything inside of the glacier, and subglacial is anything below the glacier. So you can have, for example, meltwater subglacially. So what meltwater when it's subglacial will just cause basal slip because it's in between the glacier and the bedrock, so it's just, reducing friction, right? So this isn't only for rocks, okay? But what entrainment is, if I'm going to type out a definition for you, I'm going to say that entrainment is the incorporation of debris onto or into the glacier from supraglacial or subglacial sources. So the reason that I say supraglacial or subglacial sources is because plucking technically isn't an input of stuff. It's an input of rocks into the glacier, because what plucking really does is it just kind of grabs the rock and detaches it, but it doesn't always take it in with it. Its entrainment is basically just supraglacial, so above the glacier or below the glacier, subglacial sources. But if you write something like, plucking causes rocks to come in here and that's entrainment, that's not particularly wrong. This is just the definition that I've come up with, and that is entrainment.